All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice break and a nice lunch. We are ready to go now with Dr. Tom Chavez, and he is beaming, I think his word, beaming in from Spain. So I'd like to first introduce Aiko Allen, who is our facilitator for this session. Aiko's career has been in public health and social justice. It spans 3 decades. She has focused primarily on Indigenous health and well-being issues on a government-to-government basis. She's a longtime member of the New Mexico Japanese American Citizens League, is a member of the Anniversary Event Planning Committee, and organizer extraordinaire.
All right, so I know it was a fast dash for lunch. Apologies on that. So I hope that you were able to get a little something to eat. And clearly, we must not have turned you away in the morning. You're back. And so thank you very much. So what I'm here to do is moderate a panel that will be a point in time. So we're going to start with the perspectives of 3 incredible people. We have a 4th, Carol Robertson Lopez, who was originally going to be on this panel, but she is in Johannesburg, South Africa, in quarantine with COVID, although fully vaccinated and double boosted. But again, from a public health standpoint, we know there's just lots of unknowns with COVID. And so we are wishing her the best, as well as prayers to Doc Weaver's family during this time of the memorial that's being held. Thank you, Gail. So what we're going to do is really talk about the controversy, the community atmosphere, all of the things that were happening that are different angles on a very complex issue. And we're going to begin with Dr. Tom Chavez, who was serving as the director of the New Mexico History Museum. And he is just a remarkable individual. How would you like to talk about your work getting into the History Museum, Tom?
Unremarkably. Start with that. Well, let's just start with that. I'm a historian more than anything. I have my degrees in history, and so I believe in history. And I had the good fortune to get the job to be director of the State History Museum in the good town of Santa Fe, and that's where this all started with the marker for the camp. Just me being a historian in the State History Museum. And you want me to go on and how it all started?
Yes,
okay.
Please.
Okay, I'll preempt your questions, I guess.
You probably will, Tom.
Yeah, you know, I came to this a little bit prepared in that I grew up in Los Angeles, where my dad was a judge, and he had become friends with a lot of the Japanese American community there in the legal community. For example, the judge that sat over the trial of O.J. Simpson's civil suit was a friend of my father's, and actually came to Santa Fe and visited me in my office. And my dad was a fisherman, and so were these Japanese Americans. And every year they'd rent a bus and go up the Owens River Valley to Lake Crowley to do this fishing derby thing. And I, as a teenager, got to go along with them one year. And as we were going up the Owens Valley, they started talking about these ruins that we were going by on the side of the road. Well, those were the ruins of Manzanar. And when I said, well, what's Manzanar? Then I got the whole lecture from more than one person. And my dad, the judge, was saying that was, just a travesty of justice and a black mark in our history. And this is from a man who fought in the South Pacific against the Japanese, occupying islands and doing Lucky to Survive and everything in the Marine Corps. And so as the director of the museum, we started getting questions in our history library about the internment camp, and we had nothing in the library about it. And that struck me as very odd. And at the same time, I was writing a monthly article for the New Mexican, and I wrote an article with about my curiosity about this piece of lost history. And to get some information, I had to search long and hard and found one article that written by a fellow historian, a very good New Mexican historian, Richard Melzer, had written an article about the camp. And that was basically all the information I had to go on outside of stories or rumors that it was over in the Casa Solana district. And so I wrote this article about this lost history. In fact, I think the article's title was Lost History, and concluded the article with, wouldn't it be interesting if we started collecting all stuff from people in the community that had pictures and letters or whatever about it, and that we even placed a monument someplace over there in Casa Solana district to remember this, a part of our history. That led to Doc Weaver coming to me and saying, well, Tom, why don't we do something about it? And I need to say right now, if it weren't for this, I would probably, no, I couldn't. They didn't Zoom me for his memorial, but, Doc is a key player in all of this. And so Doc and I started to form the committee, and right away, Joe Ando came on board. Joe Ando himself had been in a camp as a child with his mother at Crystal Lake in Texas, and his father had been sent to Santa Fe. And so, and both Doc and Joe Ando were retired colonels from the Air Force. So they're both veterans. And I am myself. So we had 3 veterans going with the okay of an ex-Marine World War II veteran to do this. And right away, I knew that there was going to be some controversy because New Mexico has a very long and strong tradition of the Bataan death marchers, of the artillery National Guard units that were called up and sent to the Philippines and got there in time for the war to break out and the Japanese invasion of the Philippines. And of course, MacArthur's distasteful, I'll say that openly, surrender and leaving, taking his family and family pets and leaving the island and leaving all his men to be captured and then suffering a horrible experience. And it was a horrible experience for them, those that survived. It was just awful. And so we still had some survivors of all of that alive in New Mexico. And of course, their immediate families, their daughters and sons and grandchildren were all alive, and the memory was, fresh in their minds. So we started running into that kind of resistance. And it created a thing. It was a historical controversy that was both emotional, had both emotional differences and philosophical differences about it all. And I, as a historian, just felt like history has got to be the truth, which is kind of a simple thing to say given today's politics. But I was always seeking the truth, and so we went ahead with it, and eventually figured out that where we wanted this was going to have to be on a city park, and we had to deal with the politics of dealing with that. Doc Weaver and I handled that. Well, Joe Ando started, first of all, he started with his own collection of stuff to give us information, but he started contacting people. We started, filled out the committee that way. This went on for a while. And it became very obvious that this was going to be a hard sell to the city council, and for real reason. Santa Fe is not that big now, and it was even smaller then. And these guys came from particular districts, and in those districts lived the survivors and their families. And so you could lose your seat by just 20 or 30 votes in some of those districts if you didn't watch it. And if you got somebody riled up, they would take more than that. And so now we had counselors, thinking about what this all meant to them in their short political careers. And so we knew that. And so it was going to be a hard nut to sell. And one of the biggest problems with it was some of the veterans that ended up opposing us just could not fathom in their minds that any Japanese American served in the U.S. Armed Forces and fought in World War II. They just refused to believe that, much less even at the time, even though Joe Ando, obviously a retired colonel in the United States Air Force, disproved that point. And so the controversy got very heated, and I'm going to let Gerard speak when his turn comes. That's where he jumped in and formed all the sessions at the center over there where we all met and everything, and that got things going. Where I felt like maybe we're going to turn the tide here a little bit. And one of the things that turned the tide was a photo that came out of those sessions. And it was Doc Weaver consoling Millie Ando, Joe Ando's wife. She was talking about her experience in Crystal Lake and being separated from her parent, her father too. And she started crying, and Doc leaned over to console her, and the local newspaper took a photo of it and published it in the front page. So now, instead of just voices in the wind and shouting and hollering, we're beginning to connect faces, and that's thanks to Gerard, really, connect faces and stories to real things that were happening. The next thing that happened was Joe Ando brought in some of his stuff, and in his collection is the photo that we're going to put up in just a second. It's this fantastic photo of a funeral at the Santa Fe camp. And it's all the inmates arrayed around a casket of one of the inmates who had died there. And right immediately behind the casket in center stage is a young Japanese American man in a US Army uniform. He was called back from Europe to attend his father's funeral. Got that photo with Joe's permission and took it to the New Mexican, and they published it on the front page. Now there could be no doubt that some of these people not only were citizens of the United States, but some of them had sons who were fighting in World War II and putting their lives at risk, some of them dying, as we know. And that, when I would talk about the 442nd Regiment that was talked about earlier, the highest decorated unit in the European theater of World War II, those were all Japanese American soldiers fighting Germans. And that photo became the key, insofar as I'm concerned, for the whole thing. Still, the politics the politics were hard. The city council, the poor councilors were caught in the middle, and none of us, much less politicians, love to be caught with either way you go, you're going to be in trouble. But sometimes you have to make the hard decisions, and so we weren't quite sure how the vote was going to go. And Doc and I were trying to talk to the different counselors and deal with the politics and all of that. We talked to the city parks, and I think his name was Ron Shirley, the head of city parks, who was trying to help us to locate a place, and he found the place where the marker eventually went. All that stuff was going on. And then Patty Boucher on the council came forward and point blank told us that she supported us and would introduce the resolution or bill, whatever that was called back then. But then the council meeting came, the date of that, and she decided to table the whole thing because the vote wasn't there. And so, it was still iffy going on. At the second meeting, it was held in October of '99, I believe. Let me look that up somewhere here. Doesn't matter. The second, October 27th, 1999. The city council was met, and they were going to have the vote. And so it was a roll call vote, and they went down to finally, there was one vote left, and the nays, the people not in favor of the marker, were ahead by one vote. And Ms. Robertson, who's unfortunately sick in Johannesburg, cast the vote to tie it. She cast in favor. And so the vote was tied, and that fell to the mayor, who was Larry Delgado, who incidentally was a very good mayor in my mind, and a man of multi-generational New Mexican, a man who had lived in Santa Fe his whole life, as had his family, like Frank Montano, who was sitting there. And so he knew, I'm sure he had friends and political allies who were opposed to this, as well as friends and allies who were in favor of it. So I'm sure, he grieved over having to make this vote, but when it came to the time to make it, he didn't hesitate and voted in favor. And so it was approved. Then the matter was us raising the money for the marker, and then writing the words that are on the memorial. And I was interviewed earlier, and it was interesting because I didn't have access to my notes then, but it turns out I forgot more than I remembered when I was being interviewed. Doc Weaver did the original text for the marker, and then it came to the committee to be edited, and boy, did we. And it was left to Joando and I to pare it down, cut it down a lot, and redirect it a little bit. And that was done with everybody's approval. And then, of course, we had the big ceremonial where everybody came. And I remember the one man that we were able to use our funds to fly him in for it. The one survivor of the camp that we located was there. And I emceed the ceremony. Joando gave the key address, and other people spoke, and it was a windy day, but a good day. About 200 people or so were there. And then we had a banquet after. I remember, that banquet was just it's going to be like the banquet you're going to have. It was just so nice. All the people coming together, feeling good, and from all the different sides. In the meantime, we raised money, and we had extra money. We saved some of it to help preserve whatever we got in the collections in the library, but we also donated money to a new memorial that was going to be done to the Bataan Death Marchers. That idea came up in reaction to our idea, and we didn't oppose the Bataan Death Marcher thing. They deserve to be recognized as well as anybody. And so we made a contribution out of our fund to them. And in the end, that worked out. Frank can talk about the city council meeting. It was pretty tense. The place was full, it was standing room only. I won't name any names, but there were some people that were they just were adamant against it. And when the vote was finally, when Larry Delgado cast the deciding vote, one person who was politically connected jumped up and said, "You've just kicked the Bataan Death Marchers in the teeth at the twilight of their life." And then somebody told him to sit down, and somebody else started yelling at him, and he yelled back, and they had to call the police in to break it up. But after that, there was, things quieted down. We had the memorial. No one has done anything to it. It's been accepted. And now, I always said that it was important that we do the history, and sometimes history's not a pretty thing. History is not politically correct. And there are things about history that are ugly and not. And so it's like us, we have to accept who we are for our faults and be better for it. And I believe that's what history teaches too. And this was a perfect occasion of that. And that was stated often. And actually, I stated it in one of where they interviewed me in the paper in the process. I says, history is history. It's the truth. And if some people can't accept it, I can't help it. And that rubbed some people wrong when I said that. Probably rubbed more people wrong today, given the environment. But that's how I felt then, and I still feel. And so, for me, this whole episode was a product of sharing history, and history won out, and truth won out in the end. And thanks to the two people sitting on the stage, that's where we are today.
So Tom, that was a rapid move through. I think, it's always remarkable to be in a room with historians. Gail being out here, Gail Okawa is here, and Billy Garrett continues to be with us. And so it feels like all of us will be the retainer of story. We've come here to absorb and also to pass these stories forward to others. And so we appreciate, that you are setting the landscape for the controversy, and then all of its different aspects. And I know it's after lunch, probably hard to process, but I would like to point out that in room 15 of this museum, there is a set of exhibits that you can go through at your leisure. It will be up for at least another week. So just as you potentially on another day decide to come back and consider, well, what is it that I should remember, so that there is never again. And I think that is often something that is said among the Japanese American communities that are working together. Never again. Tom, you've talked about the city council atmosphere. And Frank, I know that you served on city council for 12 years and that you were present, you were in the room when the vote was taken and all the way through that process. So what brought you to city council to begin with?
Well, what brought me to the city council, or the will to want to run for a public office, is that at the time when I did decide to run, I was head of a youth group at my local parish here in Santa Fe, St. Anne's Parish. And for me, I was always trying to find funds for the young people so that they could do various activities. And that was why I wanted to run, was because I saw that the city council was not allocating enough funds for youth activities. And we had at that time, there was actually a city councilor who was a great advocate of youth. Her name was Bernie Beanhauer. But she always didn't have the support she needed to get the things that she wanted done, although she quite well managed to do that. And so anyway, what really brought me to the city council was youth issues and social issues. That's what I really wanted to use that platform for. But ended up finding out that, yeah, you could do something like that. You could advocate for the youth and you could advocate for social issues, but you were really there for land use. And of course, land use isn't always a clean kind of an affair. So, there was lots of dogfights over land use, and then there were other issues that were also very controversial. And certainly, if I may now lead into the actual decision-making process, this was probably of the 12 years that I was on the city council, I know it was one of the most heated. It was definitely one of the most controversial. I can only remember one other issue that was more controversial, and that's back in the early 1990s when we had a police officer who was called to a domestic violence issue that was occurring out right there by St. Anne's Parish, actually, where we had a young man who was upset and had mental problems and apparently had been drinking that day. And unfortunately, he had a kitchen knife with him, which one officer thought was threatening enough to shoot him and kill him. And so, that was probably the biggest hot button issue I ever faced on the city council. And it did lead to eventually, during the next administration, that was during the Pick administration, but during the WWll administration, we actually created these roundtables to start discussing how we as Santa Feans could become better acquainted with the police community. And we had a whole series of roundtable discussions. I mean, it was incredible what occurred in terms of those roundtable discussions. And eventually that did lead to a police community initiative. But at any rate, down the road, years later, this issue came up. And I do remember Tom and others coming to to lobby the city council in terms of providing a space for this historical marker to be placed here in the city. And appropriately, Ron Shirley found a great location, and rest his soul, he's not with us anymore, but Ron Shirley found a beautiful location there on top of the hill up on Camino de las Crucitas, and it looks right down on where that concentration camp was located. And so, you know, it was a huge controversy, no doubt. And it did take some time for Patty Boucher to find the support that she needed or hope that she had, because I think that right up until the actual meeting, there was no clear indication as to how this vote was going to go. But eventually she felt comfortable enough to introduce the resolution. And if you're familiar with city government, you know, there are ordinances, there's laws that the city's passed, but there are also resolutions, and resolutions are non-binding kinds of documents that are written for a specific purpose. And a resolution is not normally an issue that would allow for a public input. Usually resolutions were put on a consent calendar where you just voted on a whole slew of issues at once. And that was it. They were sort of the, you know, it was a foregone conclusion that the resolution was going to pass. And so that's the way that worked. But in this particular issue, that resolution was so controversial that the council and the mayor decided that it needed to be a type of issue that we allowed for the public to speak and express their views. And so after the first vote being delayed, and it was eventually brought to the city council, it was very intense, extremely intense. The room was packed, and you could feel the anxiety and the intensity of everyone that was there. I mean, you had the veterans of the Bataan March who were there, of course, and you know, 1,800 New Mexico National Guardsmen went to the Philippines and were caught there when McCarthy decided to leave them. And of those 1,800, only half came home. And of that half that came home, soon after, about 400 more of them died because of illness or whatever. And I mean, these were, for those men that survived, most of them never talked about the experience that they went through there in the Philippines, but we certainly heard a little bit about what they went through that day. And of course, we also heard about, you know, how those that had relatives that had been at the concentration camp, how they felt and what they went through. And it was very intense, and it did get ugly, no doubt. It got ugly. And you know, my father is a World War II veteran, and he left us a couple of years ago. And my uncle's a World War II veteran. He lost his life there in the Pacific War. And he actually went through 3 campaigns. He only had to go through 2, but through 1, but he actually wanted to stay on and fight. And so, you know, I had a connection with my family in terms of, you know, folks that being in the war that I knew. And I remember having a discussion with my father about this issue, and it was, because he's not with us anymore, it's hard for me, but we had a discussion, and you know, he sort of assured me that whatever I decided was fine with him, but that he really wanted me to understand what those folks went through and how hard it was for them, you know, given that they've gone through that horrible experience of the death, of the surrender, the death march, and then the enduring of the camp. And so it was very hard decision for me, because you know, when you're raised Catholic all your life, and honor your mother and your father is something that you hold you hold that true to your heart. It was a difficult decision for me because of the discussion that me and my father had, but I knew in my mind that, I've always been of the opinion, I still am, that here in Santa Fe, we tolerate one another, the different aspects of our community, we tolerate one another. And I've always wondered, when are we going to get to the point where we actually respect one another? And at any rate, I knew in my heart that that was a horrific thing for some of our Santa Feans and New Mexicans to experience, but I also knew in my heart that it was hard for those who had relatives that were in that concentration camp. It was hard on them as well, because as Tom indicated, some of them were citizens, some of them actually served with the US military. And, it's horrible to be incarcerated for whatever reason. And so anyway, I do remember the public discussion came on, and we were there all listening, the 9 of us. And, the folks got up and they explained of what they felt their relatives had endured in the concentration camp. And then you had the veterans. And I could fully understand their bitterness. And they were bitter, no doubt about it. They were bitter. They were bitter to no end. And I could understand why they felt the way they felt, and how, honoring or memorializing or remembering something Japanese that occurred in Santa Fe, nothing they wanted to have anything to do with. And so it was ugly, no doubt, but I knew in my heart that we needed to provide the space for the monument for a few reasons. Number one, we preserve history here in Santa Fe, or up until this point, we have. We'll see how that goes from this point on. But here in Santa Fe, we have always promoted history, culture, the preservation of architecture, the preservation of all these kinds of things that are dear to us here in Santa Fe. And I knew that we had to, put that marker up there so that people would remember what occurred there and what happened there, so that we don't forget, so that we don't make the same mistakes. And no matter how hard we've worked to try to do that, we're still making mistakes. But I knew for my part that we needed to preserve the history. We needed to allow for there to be a place where future generations could understand and know what occurred during World War II and what occurred here in Santa Fe during World War II. We not only had the concentration camp, we had the Burns hospital out where the College of Santa Fe used to be. It's now the Midtown. I forget what they call it now, the Midtown, whatever. And anyway, that I knew we had to preserve history. But I also knew that in the back of my mind, we had to do something to try to heal the issues that divide us. And if that meant that we had to have ugly dialogue, then so be it. And I do remember the vote. It was you could have dropped a pin on the floor and heard the ping of the pin. And it came to the vote. And of course, the city clerk called us individually, and you could see where it was going. It was going to be a tie. At least I could. And of course, when I became a member of the city council, the mayor then was Sam Pick, and he always said, Frank, there's one thing you need to remember about city council, is that you have to remember the number 5, because that's what it takes. That's what it takes to pass a resolution or to pass an ordinance to the city. And in some cases, you even need 6. In this case, you needed 5. And so the vote came down, and of course, everybody was quiet, and you could hear Councilor Montano, yes. Councilor Sanchez, no. Councilor Chavez, no. Councilor Boucher, yes. And I don't remember the names of all the counselors at the time. I forget one of them. I was thinking last night, who were the 8 counselors that were there? And I could remember 7. I could remember the 8th, and I still can't. But at any rate, it did come down to the last council vote, and at that point, it was 3-4. And Councillor Robertson did cast the last vote. She was alphabetically Robertson. She was the last person they would call. And so she did vote yes. And so then you could see all eyes turn to the mayor. And the mayor, of course, as Tom indicated, had no hesitation. He had no hesitation. And he did have a lot to lose. And he indicated that his vote was yes. And so then we had more disruption in the council chambers, but it was no doubt the right thing to do, because we just gotta remember what occurred and the tragedies that we have dealt one another. And we need to learn to live together and in peace. You know, I think now I happen to be right now involved with our Fiestas de Santa Fe. One of my friends, good friends, Doug Nava, he's going to portray the role of Don Diego de Vargas. And so I'm going to be a part of his cuadrilla, the horsemen and the members of the Vargas administration at the point, and his soldiers. And so, you know, today, we no longer call the wooden statue that came to Santa Fe back in 1625, La Conquistadora, Our Lady of the Conquest. We now refer to her as Our Lady of the Peace. And that for some Santa Feans even today is hard to understand. But as we move forward, we have to, like I say, we have to, and you know, I look at the United States today, I say, darn, we're even further apart than we were not long ago. But we got to get to that point where we do begin to not only, in some places, people don't even tolerate each other in this country, but at least here in Santa Fe, we do that. And at some point, I really hope that we come to respect one another. And I think that that was probably the main reason that I voted to have that monument placed up there, is because we need to learn how to respect one another.
Tom Chavez, historian, Frank Montano, city council person. I'm just thinking, you know, soon we're going to speak with Gerard here, Martinez y Valencia, who was a former director of cultural affairs. Cultural affairs, would you say? Intercultural affairs. And yet what I want to just note is the courage that it takes to speak from the heart with all of us here in the room, you know, many of us not knowing each other, and yet you spoke, you know, tenderly of your father and the difficulties of what it is to have voice, and also when you have voice, what it is to speak and speak truth to power, or speak your mind. And so much hinges on communication and interrelationship. And do we have the willingness to be messy in a room and willingness to trust? So Gerard, I want to have you also provide your perspective and additional narrative.
Thank you. I feel somewhat like I'm about to deliver a soliloquy in a Shakespearean play, and Orion is overlooking the whole thing. Thank you. It's an honor. It really is an honor to be here, and I welcome especially families, relatives, descendants of the entire Japanese internment camp process. We've had some great stories, and how it really appeals to our community and really relates to our community. I also want to point out to David Marquardt, who was part of the ICO team that I'm going to speak about with the process. So April of '99, wanted to correct that with you, Mr. Historian, it was April when Patty Boucher introduced the monument proposal. And it was pretty big. I think you remember that too, Jerry, that it was, we were looking at a large monument. And she knew she wasn't going to be able to get the support. And that's when it was tabled, because we thought we already had a process in place. But Frank didn't tell you about that. Frank was part of the council that had the architecture of community dialogue in this community. Those roundtables that he was talking about in 1996, after 1996 death of Pancho Ortega, a lot of things came out of that, not only with the police oversight, but the Office of Intercultural itself. And so the first thing I took on was the summer before a cruising issue. We had some upset, now you remember that. We had some businesses that were kind of upset. Cruising has always been a part of Santa Fe as long as there's been motorized cars. It just happens that the cruisers, they're really organized, and they had clubs, and they were cruising down Alameda, which they call Riverside. And the first thing Dr. Muir told me, the city managers, to take care of it, meet with them. So I started meeting with the cruisers and the businesses and realized we have an issue, and it could get very divisive real quick. But what we did, and were you there for that part too, David? Yeah. So what we did right away was we used the model of the architecture that was already existing, but then we used ICOL then to develop a process into bringing both sides together and define the common ground. And part of the resolution was to have a police presence. And that seemed to satisfy everybody, including the cruisers. They wanted a police presence too. They started saying, what, we get picked on too. We get harassed. So it would be great. And it was a great resolution. So about 14 months later, then actually, 13 months later, we had to develop another process. But again, we had the architecture, we had the process in place, and we had the resources. But we realized in the first organization meeting in council chambers was that we were going to have a series of discussions here. And it was very, very apparent that this was going to be quite divisive, and we had our hands full. This was a little bit different, including Pancho, because Pancho's death led to some really positive things that happened in the city. So we've decided, everybody decided at that meeting that we would have 3 meetings in the convention center, and we would give everybody enough participation. Much to the disagreement of the person that was very vocal at that particular vote in October, stating that the veterans, nobody was invited. We, along with the Intercultural Affairs Board, went all out. We used city staff to do invites, whether it was personal, phone calls, notices in the newspaper. We went all out and we tried to inform as many people as we could in facets. We had a pretty good turnout. I think overall, consistently, we had about 75 participants through the process. We found common ground. And that was one of the basic things that common ground here in Santa Fe is we choose to live here. And that's the first thing we have to start out with. We choose to live here. Doesn't matter if we've been here for generations or it's just been a couple of months or a couple of years. So we had to try to find within that common ground some sort of respect. And I think, Frank, we did find it within that process. But I agree with you overall, and I think we saw its ugly face a couple of years ago, that there's a lack of respect when it comes down to that. But we were able to find a lot of really good qualities out of this process. It was, we heard some tough stories. There were disagreements. And what came out of it was something that's been lacking And it's true that Frank has mentioned that the resolution is non-binding, but yet we used the process to really bind the resolution for the historical camp marker. But what also came out, and what we're forgetting in this entire discussion, is that the agreement was that we would build a monument to honor veterans of Santa Fe. We have those monuments here in town, but they belong to the state. There's only one that we really do own, and that is the veterans, Vietnam Veterans Monument at Frank Raga Park in Barrio de la Cañada, which out of this process, we redid that park. And I know I'm going down a couple rabbit holes. I will bring it around, because out of this dialogue came that when Carlos Roybal, a veteran of the Vietnam era, was part of the conversation, part of the dialogue. But when it was all said and done, the mayor gave me the charge to make a commitment to work a lot closer with the veteran community, and it did. Well, Carlos called me and told me to go to the Vietnam Veterans Park. He says, go take a look and tell me what you see. So he says, tell me what you feel about the plaque. And I will say this, it was a pinche plaque, about 8 by 10 on a small pedestal by the trash can, with the names of those from Santa Fe that gave up their lives in the Vietnam conflict. I was outraged, and I didn't realize that, and that was part of our parks inventory. So I called him back up. He says, you want to meet? I said, yes. So met with him, Bill Coppola, and a few other Vietnam veterans. And what we did, that became a resolution that was past this controversy, but this, I'm trying to give you some ideas of what this led to. That was a slam dunk too with the council. Bill Coppola bought the granite and donated the concrete. And I invite you to go there sometime. It's a beautiful memorial to Vietnam veterans. So we thought, great, we have that. We formed a committee and they gave criteria of what they wanted. And what we ended up with, we actually chose a site, and it is just as amazing as the Japanese internment camp historical marker. And the site that was chosen was up at Prince Park. How many of you know where Prince Park is? How many of you know where the Cross of the Martyrs is?
Mhm.
Okay, as you're facing the city of Santa Fe, the Cross of the Martyrs behind you is this asphalt driveway, and in the middle is a small obelisk. Carlos had actually negotiated an agreement with the Prince family to move that obelisk to the entrance of the park. And the reason we chose that too was that there would have to be no archaeological dig, any survey whatsoever, which would have caused 2 years plus on the delay. So we were talking about bringing this forward to the council, and the new administration came, and that got kind of swept aside. But that was the ideal resolution to honor what was 94, the resolution prior to the vote of the internment camp. So that took a bit of a process, but still we came up with something. And the reason for that asphalt, that place, was there would have to be no digging whatsoever, that the monument could be placed on there. So we came up with a really great resolution, but it's been left. And there have been 3 mayoral administrations, including this one, which have failed to honor that, but it's non-binding. And that's the unfortunate part. But I promise I'll try to bring it to everybody's attention real soon. As we came back now to the internment camp, we were getting we documented, we have the notes from the meetings that has survived. Unfortunately, we cannot find all of the process right now. We've requested from the city, from archives, to try to give us as much as they can. They're having difficulty giving all that information, because we really need to bring it to the museum here and they can keep it. So when we brought all this together, then we had lobbying with the city councilors about the vote. And so you all were being approached by not only committee members, but also I think members of the board of the Office of Intercultural Affairs. We knew we had a solid 3 count for. We knew we had a solid no. The meeting prior to, I remember calling my dear friend and mentor, Dr. Tom Chavez, to address the council because we didn't know if he was going to be able to be there for the vote. And that is another transcript I'm trying to get because he really laid into them in a very positive, and I would say almost assertive, aggressive way, and reminding them that, you know, history is taking place. New Mexico is rich in history, yet we are dysfunctional. And like a family, we do have those issues. But when all is said, we do have a history, and that you cannot deny history. The fact that history happened here, he said it much better than what I'm paraphrasing now. So now I want to get to the vote, the actual vote. Council, you're absolutely right. It was thick. It was tough. I couldn't get anything out of my dear friend and my own city councilor, Carol Robertson Lopez. I could talk a little because she's not here to defend herself. She made it so darn difficult. And it was just like, we couldn't get either way. And in Pauline's, in her film that we will all get to see, hopefully sometime at the end of this year, No Pressure, Pauline.
Claudia.
Claudia, rather.
Mhm.
Claudia, I'm sorry. No Pressure, Claudia. She already has some excerpts of Carol Robertson talking about her process in voting. So as Frank was talking about, all you need is 5. On my left hand, after the presentation that I gave, on the right hand were the 4s and the 3s. I mean, the negatives were on my left hand. And it was always like this for a while. And then it was down to this. Carol started talking, it was this, that we have failed. And she started going on about veterans, honoring our elders, everything else. And then she started saying, quoting the song, "You of the tender years don't know the fears that your elders lived by." And all of a sudden I went like this. And I knew what was going to happen because we already talked to the mayor. And so it was that final 4-4 tie, and the mayor was quick on that. And when he gave the vote and there was a little rustling from the crowd, he gavelled a recess, and I went to the back to try to get deflection between him, reporters, and anybody that was going to attack him, because he was going to go recess in his office. And I was able to do that, and I told him just to keep going and we would take care of the rest, and we did. And it was one of the most incredible and most honorable processes I've ever been through. And I'm glad that I was able to be part of it. I'm so honored to be part of it, because now we're here 20 years later, and we are going to continue this. And I have a lot of hope, because we were talking, there's a lot of youth that we have been seeing, and we need your help to continue, because the moment we stop, things get forgotten, people forget, and then what do we have to rely on? So the more we can promote this, the better off it is. The more we can get school children in here and to get those tours and let them know that this was part of their hometown too. And so I guess we're getting to the part now where we open up for questions.
Yes, I thought those of us who live often in facilitator land, yes, we know that time is rugged. And so we can take a few questions. I know those who are with us virtually will do our best. The 2:30 panel, which is on our through lines to the present, are waiting eagerly. But if there are a couple of questions, we'll entertain them.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a table setting question. How many people were in the camp here? Where did they come from? For example, were they from from our state? No, they came from elsewhere. And what was the camp like? How was it felt in the community at that time? Can
I think that that's a question that I'm going to give
can we
to
have a
Gail
comment on
Okawa, who was with us for the morning session briefly, because I know that's a lengthy answer that we could give, but perhaps just a number of folks and.
We know that there were 4,555 men in the camp at different times. They were not there all at the same time. And what was the other part?
And where from?
They were from all over the country, actually, and outside of the country. They were from within the country. They were from California, the West Coast. They were also from Alaska, from Hawaii, and we know also that there was a component of Latin Americans who were brought in, arrested in their home countries, and brought in, some people say, to trade for American prisoners.
were they all men?
Yes, in Santa Fe, they were all men. Yes, they were all adult, and the average age was 55. 55, yes. So there were some very elderly and there were some younger men.
Thank you so much for that question. I have one from our virtual audience. Many World War II confinement sites like Santa Fe faced preservation difficulties with local, state, and federal authorities and agencies, largely land use related. What one critical recommendation or lesson learned would you have for organizations working to preserve other sites?
I think definitely getting the policymakers together and any of the citizens, landowners, anybody that's going to be impacted, and have public hearings. Try to set up a series with some entity that's going to be able to facilitate that and go through the process.
Thank you, Gerard. And we have one more question that we can take.
Thank you. My name is Renee Villarreal. I'm a city councilwoman, and I just wanted to honor the candidness that you provided for us. I really appreciate it, Councilor Montano, because I don't think we get to talk about the hard decisions that we have to make on the council. Lately, we've had a lot. And I think, I guess, well, first I want to say I'm really disappointed that I never got to learn growing up here in Santa Fe about the internment camp. Never knew about it. Never knew the Japanese internment camp existed in Santa Fe. And I think that's such a loss for a lot of the people that grew up here that didn't understand or hear about our histories. On the flip side of that too, I also want to just lift up what Councilor Montano is talking about, is the history of our city and how a lot of cultures, especially Hispano and Native people, feel like they're invisibilized, that they don't get to talk about their history, and people just brush it off like it's not, it was in the past. And so I think there's certain situations that happen in the council even now where people, it's very emotional for people because they feel like they have not been heard for a long time. And so that lack of respect that you're talking about, it's painful.
Thank you, Councilwoman.
And I do have a question though.
Well, I do want to add too, with that, part of that pain that I see that you have and that I feel all the time is that us mestizos are caught in the middle.
That's right.
When it is posed against Native American against Hispano. Tom can speak way better than I can on this.
We could have a whole lecture on that.
It is even tougher for us because then we're told we've got to choose a side. There is no side to choose.
That's right.
And that's what makes it difficult.
And I guess what my question is now that the controversial issue of the day now is the obelisk and just what that means to people, what it doesn't mean to people. And then we have this process happening. I don't know if anyone knows about the chart process. Is anyone part of the chart process here? I mean, it's this process that has been somewhat flawed because we're in COVID. And so people don't get to have those circles. They don't get to have those spaces of healing in person, to have dialogue in front of people versus on Zoom. So I guess I'm just curious what your thoughts are of bringing back the intercultural office or Office of Intercultural Affairs, because I've been talking about an iteration of that that would be like equity and diversity. Maybe that's the new name, but what that could look like for Santa Fe again, if you think that that's needed, and maybe the three of you have a perspective on that.
Dust it off and bring it back. It's been gone for way too long. If there was an Office of Intercultural Affairs, that obelisk would still be standing. And I will argue that with anybody who disagrees with me. But the process was in place. The architecture was there. The processes were designed and it was in place. And after the WWll administration, it was then mothballed. And so we have seen what has happened since then. And then all of a sudden we have people who, and in all due respect, some who've come and are city leaders, they don't know enough about what has happened. This isn't that long ago, Counselor. It wasn't. We're talking, this process was 20 years ago. Our Lady process was about the same amount of time. So what do? We forget about it. And that's what I'm trying to point out is when we tend to forget those things that work and are good for our community, what has happened the past 15-ish years, that's what happens.
I want to
So,
add one thing.
Let's see. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Just very quickly, and it's mainly for the counselor. And I think that it's time for this chart process to become face-to-face. And you
Agreed.
have an opportunity to promote that. And I also think it's time for the city council to allow folks to come back into the chambers. It's
We haven't
you can
even made
see
it.
that right here, it's working. It can work there.
And if you do
Thank you.
need to delay the process because of that, Counselor, there's nothing wrong with that. If now is the time that we can get together face-to-face, then extend that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. And so I know, again, our panel is waiting. Tom, thank you so much from Spain.
Thank you. Thank you.
So much to say, no? Just so much from our hearts and the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.